Hitler was her godfather. 500 Luftwaffe jets roared over Berlin to celebrate her birth, and Renaissance paintings arrived as baptism gifts, masterworks that would hang in any museum in the world. By every measure, Edda Göring was Nazi royalty, the regime's crowned little princess. But by age 7, she was sitting in an Allied internment camp, watching footage of concentration camps, skeletal survivors, mass graves, the full horror of what her father's regime had built. The Allies believed this would break the spell, show a child the evidence, and she'll reject the monster. They were wrong. 72 years later, Edda Göring died still defending her father, convinced the only thing he did wrong was lose the war. This is the story of the Nazi crown princess who refused to condemn her father, and what that refusal cost her. If you're interested in the hidden aftermath stories of World War II, subscribe to History Hangover. We explore what most documentaries leave out: the world she lost. To understand why Edda never broke, you first have to understand what she lost. This wasn't ordinary childhood privilege. This was something closer to a fairy tale written by a totalitarian state. The Luftwaffe, her father's personal empire, built Edda a miniature replica of Frederick the Great's palace, 50 metres long, 7 metres wide, complete with its own theatre stage where she could perform plays for an audience of 1. Herself. The construction required military resources, military labour, and military precision. All for a child's playhouse. Her baptism gifts would make a museum curator weep. Lucas Cranach, The Elder Paintings. Renaissance masterworks worth millions even then. The ceremony took place on November 4th, 1938 at Hall, the vast hunting estate her father had constructed north of Berlin. Adolf Hitler stood as godfather. Edda called him Uncle Addy. He brought her chocolates. The estate itself was a monument to plunder. Stolen art lined the walls, works seized from Jewish families across occupied Europe, from museums in conquered territories, from anyone too weak to refuse. Hermann Göring didn't just collect these pieces, he curated them obsessively, building one of the largest private art hoards in history while millions starved under Nazi occupation. And at the centre of all this stolen beauty sat a little blonde girl who believed the world had been built specifically for her enjoyment. Nazi officials called her the Kleine Prinzessin, the Little Princess. International journalists dubbed her the Shirley Temple of Nazi Germany. Her photographs appeared in magazines. Her birthday parties became state events. When she travelled, she had access to private trains. When she wanted something, it appeared. This was the universe Edda inhabited for the first 7 years of her life. Not just wealth, certainty. The absolute conviction that she was special, that her father was great, and that this glittering world would never end. Then it did. 7 years old in the ruins. The collapse came faster than anyone expected. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in, Hermann Göring made a fatal miscalculation. He sent a telegram to Hitler asking permission to assume leadership of the Reich, a reasonable request given that Hitler was trapped in a bunker beneath burning Berlin. But Hitler, paranoid and raging in his final days, interpreted it as betrayal. He expelled Göring from the Nazi Party, stripped him of all titles, and ordered his arrest. The most powerful family in the Luftwaffe became fugitives overnight. On May 21st, 1945, just days before Edda's 7th birthday, American forces captured her and her mother Emmy near Berchtesgaden. There would be no birthday celebration, no gifts, no 500 aircraft roaring overhead. Instead, mother and daughter were transported to Camp Ashcan in Mondorf, Luxembourg, an internment facility the Americans had established to hold high-ranking Nazi prisoners. What happened next was deliberate. The Allies believed in denazification through confrontation. Show people what the regime actually did, and they'll reject it. This theory was about to be tested on a 6-year-old girl. American authorities subjected Edda to re-education programs. She watched footage of concentration camps, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the mass graves at Dachau, the skeletal survivors staring into cameras with hollow eyes. These weren't abstract horrors to be processed later. They were shown to a child who had been calling Hitler Uncle Addy just months before. The expected response was shock, then rejection, then condemnation of her father. What actually happened was nothing. American officer John E. Dollibois, who observed Edda during this period, noted that she remained bright and perky, polite and well-trained, as if the world hadn't just shown her evidence that her father was a monster. He described her as a beautiful child, the image of her father. The spell hadn't broken, it had hardened. The glass between them. Hermann Göring was transported to Nuremberg to stand trial with the other surviving Nazi leaders. The charges were comprehensive: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: documents bearing his signature, testimony from survivors, film footage of the horrors his regime had created. But the trial took months, and during that time, prisoners were allowed visitors. Edda saw her father through prison glass. Whatever passed between them in those final meetings, she never revealed. We don't know what he told her. We don't know what she asked. We only know that an 8-year-old girl sat across from a man the world was preparing to execute, and that something in those conversations stayed with her for the rest of her life. On October 1st, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict: guilty on all counts. Death by hanging, scheduled for October 16th. But Hermann Göring had one final act of defiance left. On the night of October 15th, he bit down on a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell. The method of delivery was never definitively established. Some suspected a sympathetic guard, others pointed to hidden compartments in his belongings. What mattered was the result. Göring denied the Allies their execution. He died on his own terms, cheating the hangman by hours. His daughter was 8 years old, and she would spend the next 72 years denying the Allies something else: her condemnation of the man who had chosen poison over facing justice for his crimes. From palaces to well water. The punishment began immediately. German denazification courts found Emmy Göring guilty of being a Nazi, a classification that carried real consequences. She served a year in jail. 30% of the family's remaining assets were seized. She was banned from working as an actress for 5 years. But the material punishment went further. Edda and her mother were relocated to a cottage in Zachdilling, in the Bavarian countryside. No electricity, no running water. The girl who once had a 50-metre palace built for her amusement now hauled buckets from a well. The woman who had hosted state dinners for Nazi dignitaries now scrubbed floors to survive. The German state seized everything connected to Hermann Göring. The reasoning was clear: strip away the material benefits of the regime, and the psychological attachment would follow. Make the daughter feel the cost of her father's crimes through poverty and hardship, and she would eventually reject him. The theory made sense. It just wasn't true. Poverty doesn't rewrite memory. It doesn't erase the feeling of being loved, of being special, of being the centre of someone's universe. What poverty does is create bitterness, and bitterness, given enough time, becomes defiance. Emmy Göring spent her remaining years in a small Munich apartment, living on a tiny pension, and whatever support she could find from sympathetic acquaintances. She wrote an autobiography defending her husband. She never stopped believing she had been persecuted simply for being married to a prominent man. Edda watched all of this. She learned that the world would never forgive her for her name, and she concluded that if forgiveness was impossible, she might as well stop seeking it. The painting she couldn't keep. In the 1950s, Edda began fighting back. not with protests or political statements, but with lawyers. Her target was the Cranach Madonna, the Renaissance masterwork she had received at her baptism. The painting had been seized along with everything else, but Edda argued that this was different. She had been an infant. The painting was a personal gift to an innocent child. It belonged to her, not to her father's estate. The case wound through German courts for 15 years. Edda spent her 20s and 30s fighting for something she believed was rightfully hers, a piece of her lost childhood, a tangible connection to the world that had been taken from her. In 1968, the Federal Court of Justice issued its final ruling. Both parties, the court declared, had acted in violation of law and morals. The painting was returned to Cologne, where it hangs today in the Wallraf-Richartz Museum. Edda had lost, again. But the lesson she took from the defeat wasn't that her father had stolen the painting in the first place. It was that Germany was still punishing her for his name, that the sins of the father would be visited upon the daughter forever, regardless of her personal innocence. The legal battle had consumed the best years of her adult life, and when it ended, she had nothing to show for it except confirmation of what she already believed: the world would never let her escape her father's shadow. Breaking 40 years of silence. For decades after the Cranach defeat, Edda refused all press contact. She lived quietly in Munich, working as a medical technician in a hospital laboratory. She used her own name, not hiding exactly, but not inviting attention either. Journalists who tracked her down received polite refusals. Her life became a closed book. Then, in 1986, she agreed to speak with Swedish television. The interview was her first major public appearance in years. Historians expected that 4 decades of reflection might have softened her position. That time and distance might have allowed her to see her father more clearly. They were wrong. What Edda said shocked even sympathetic observers. She spoke of loving her father very much, of memories so warm and loving that she could not see him any other way. She expected, she said, that most people actually had a favourable opinion of her father, except maybe in America. She denied that he was a drug addict, despite medical evidence of his morphine dependency. She denied that he was a war criminal, despite the Nuremberg verdict. She suggested that stories about the Holocaust were exaggerated or invented. After 40 years of silence, Edda Göring hadn't softened. She had calcified. The denial that began as a child's inability to accept her father's crimes had become an adult's deliberate choice to reject the historical record entirely. The price of devotion. The cost of this loyalty wasn't measured in money or property. It was measured in connection, or rather, its absence. Edda never married. She never had children. She lived alone in a modest Munich apartment filled with heavy furniture from the 1930s. The style of her lost childhood preserved in dark wood and thick upholstery. She had studied law at the University of Munich in the 1950s, but never practiced. Instead, she spent her working life as a hospital laboratory technician, competent, quiet, unremarkable. The isolation wasn't imposed by the state, it was self-selected. Who could she trust? Who would understand her position? Every potential relationship came with impossible questions. How do you explain that you still love your father when the world considers him one of history's greatest criminals? How do you build intimacy when the most important fact about your life is something most people find morally repulsive? Edda described her true punishment not as the poverty of her childhood or the lost inheritance of her adulthood. The real punishment, she said, was the total lifelong isolation of being the only person left who loved a man the rest of the world considered a demon. She chose that isolation rather than pretend she felt differently. She chose to be alone rather than condemn the father she remembered as loving and gentle, regardless of what the historical record proved he had actually done. The final verdict. In her last interviews before 2018, Edda made her position permanent. She felt no shame about her father or the regime he had served. She believed the Allies were the aggressors, that Germany had been treated unjustly, that history was written by the victors and the victors had lied. When asked about Hermann Göring's legacy, she offered a verdict that captured everything. The only thing he did wrong was lose the war. Not the Holocaust, not the plunder, not the aggressive wars that killed tens of millions. Losing. That was his crime. But here's what makes this more than just one woman's psychological damage. The same bloodline produced the opposite conclusion. Bettina Göring, Hermann's great-niece, responded to the family legacy by getting sterilised. She explicitly chose to end the bloodline, to ensure that no more Görings would ever be born to carry that name into the future. Same family, same inheritance, same name hanging over their lives like a curse. But Edda spent 70 years defending the legacy while Bettina chose surgical extinction. In 2015, 3 years before her death, Edda filed a petition with the Bavarian Landtag requesting compensation for property seized after the war. She argued that she deserved restitution, not for everything, just enough for a subsistence livelihood. The Parliament rejected her petition unanimously. The deliberation took minutes. Even in her final years, she was still fighting, and she was still losing. The grave they had to hide. Edda Göring died on December 21st, 2018 at age 80. Her death wasn't announced immediately. Only a few close associates were informed. When German authorities finally confirmed it months later, they revealed an unusual decision. Her grave at Munich's Waldfriedhof Cemetery would remain unmarked. The location would be kept secret. Not because Edda had committed crimes. She hadn't. Not because she had led any political movement. She hadn't done that either. The grave was hidden because German authorities feared it would become a pilgrimage site for the far right, that neo-Nazis would treat the final resting place of Hitler's goddaughter as a shrine. 73 years after the Third Reich collapsed, the state still considered her symbolically dangerous. The little princess who had defended her father had become a ghost that Germany couldn't quite bury. A reminder that denazification's deepest failures weren't organisational but psychological. The Allies believed that exposure would create rejection. Show a child the camps and she'll condemn her father. Seize her inheritance and she'll understand his crimes. Force her into poverty and she'll renounce the regime. But Edda Göring proved something the denazification architects never wanted to admit. You cannot punish someone into changing their heart. The girl who saw the footage at 7 died at 80 with her love intact. Whether that represents psychological damage, moral failure, or simply the unbreakable bond between a daughter and her father depends entirely on who's telling the story and what they need it to mean. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this story compelling, check out our other deep dives into the hidden aftermath of World War II, the stories most documentaries leave out. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next.